Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
My amendment makes minor enhancements to this important piece of legislation that were brought to our attention after our markup. First, this amendment makes a few technical drafting edits. Second, this amendment clarifies the enforcement section of this legislation with a conforming edit to ensure that the U.S. Office of Special Counsel has the specific authority necessary to carry out the enforcement provisions this legislation establishes for senior government officials. With this technical change to Special Counsel's enforcement capabilities, we are ensuring that the real penalties we have introduced for senior officials can be carried out. We must ensure that senior officials will not escape accountability when they engage in government censorship prohibited by H.R. 140. This will help deter government employees. Further, this amendment clarifies that OSC can enforce a civil monetary fine of up to $10,000 against senior officials, as clearly intended by the text we reported out of committee. I ask for my colleagues' full support of this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to the amendment at the desk.
Gentleman is recognized.
You know, this is a technical amendment. It doesn't make much of a difference to what is already a bad bill, but it is interesting to me that this amendment was allowed to come to the floor, and so many amendments from the Democrats, which actually made meaningful substantive changes to this bill, were not allowed to come to the floor. Now, we've heard a lot over the past 2 months of this Congress about how the Republican majority is going to do things differently, that they're going to have open rules so that everybody can offer amendments on the floor. But what is clear is that the open rules, I suppose, only apply to the Republican Party. They don't apply to the Democratic Party. And what is upsetting about that, at least for me personally, is I had an amendment that I had also offered in the Rules Committee last night to include an exception not just for child trafficking, child exploitation, human trafficking, drug trafficking, but also for foreign interference in our elections, so that our law enforcement could actually do the work that is needed to protect our democracy, to protect our elections. And this is not some fanciful idea that this bill is actually addressing a non-existent problem where the FBI is not actually even censoring people. No, that amendment had to do with 2 charged indictments of Russians in 2016 for interfering in our election. There's actual evidence to support that amendment, and yet my Republican colleagues did not even allow it to come to the floor. With that, I'd like to yield as much time as necessary to Mr. Raskin.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Chair. Mr. Goldman, thank you. I just want to echo the very important point you just made. We have a whole sequence of trivial amendments that have been added by the majority, and they refuse to consider what I think is the central amendment that this legislation would need in order for it not to be an utter disaster for America if this legislation were to pass. Now, they concede implicitly by their legislation that there's a problem with saying we're not going to allow any government officials to get in touch with the social media because they create an exception for certain things, for child pornography, for human trafficking, and for drug dealing. And I agree with all of those. But are those more important and more grave than the national security interests of the United States itself? What about assaults on our elections, which go right to the heart of national security? What about assaults on our energy security structure? What about assaults on our power structure? Not only did they not build that into their bill, they will not even allow us to put it on the floor for an open vote among all of our colleagues in Congress. And why won't they do that? Well, because if there's a national security exception to their Putin Protection Act, at that point, the exception swallows the rule, because the rule is let's let Putin and Xi and every autocrat, theocrat, dictator on earth run amok on our social media and not allow our government officials to say anything about it. That's the effect of this legislation. Thank you for yielding, Mr. Goldman. I yield back to you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to reiterate this. This bill protects the First Amendment rights for American citizens. My colleagues would like us to believe that by protecting an American's right to say whatever lawful speech they want, we're empowering Russia and China. That's just not true. I reserve the balance of my time. I have no further speakers.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
We're prepared to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
I yield the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I think this amendment and the chairman's comments are very telling. Of course, nobody objects to protecting the free, lawful speech of any American from the federal government. That is the First Amendment. But what this bill does is it creates a tremendous barrier to our law enforcement, intelligence community, and national security apparatus from protecting Americans from all sorts of illicit, malign activity that occurs on social media. And so by preventing us from bringing our substantive, thoughtful amendments to the floor for a vote, what this bill is ultimately doing, the net effect of it, even if it's not the intent of it, is that it is allowing foreign actors to interfere in everything that happens in our democracy, including our elections. Now, why does this matter? Why would it matter? Well, because we all know the special counsel definitively proved that Russia interfered in the 2016 election to help Donald Trump win. And the Trump campaign welcomed that interference and used it for their benefit. If you disagree, go look at Special Counsel Mueller's report. That is what's called conclusions based on evidence, not what this bill is. And for that reason, we oppose this amendment as well as the underlying bill itself.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from Kentucky has no time left. The question is on